I'm going to ask Greg to talk about lung transplant, the big picture, and just set the scene moving on to research. So, Greg.
Okay, thanks, Bron, and thank you everyone for coming along and hearing part of our story as we work at the Alfred. You're an amazing group of people, and the support you've put in has made a significant difference to what the team's doing, and indeed how we're looking forward. And even in terms of looking at what we're going to talk about today, it focuses on what's working, what's not working, and where we can go. And as I'm going through, I'll be thinking I should have actually picked up more pictures of Gordon and photoshops and things in there. But anyway, so in terms of the lung transplant story, which is what I'll explain in sort of where research comes on it. Lung transplant is a therapy for severe lung disease, and its target is primarily aiming to save lives and improve quality of life. Sometimes it's more about one or the other, but saving lives is the number one thing. So it's a serious business. Lung transplant is indeed a complicated thing. You've got to take out the engine, put a new one in, connect all the parts up, and make sure it works and keep it running for forever. And there are some challenges. There's challenges getting the right timing. There's challenges getting the right donor. There's challenges of very large surgery, and then you've got this whole amount of work to keeping the car going well in the long term, keeping everything in good shape. And my little guy's there is dodging away. Infection and rejection are the two things that will be mentioned today as things that we're having to balance. Trying to stop the body rejecting the lungs and trying to stop the side effects of the rejection drugs, which can cause infections, and juggling that. And we spend our whole day doing exactly that. Lung transplant story essentially started in 1983 in Canada, and the first Alfred lung transplant was done, looking back, relatively close after that in 1990. I was in Canada in 1991, and they had done their 100th transplant at the time. We'd done our 20th. So it had taken them 7 years to do 100. Last year we did 100. There's around about 40,000 transplants done in the world, and we've done 3.5%. So 1 in 30 of those ever done have been done here at the Alfred. And as I say, last year was our biggest year with 102 transplants, and there's only about 5 units in the world doing that. There's only 15 units in the world who do more than 50. And it's a lot of work. A lung transplant, simplistically, you'd be saying you've got a sick patient, a donor who's obviously not well, or else they wouldn't be donating their lungs. You've got a waiting list, which is a challenge. You've got donor lungs that need to be removed and looked at and assessed as to how they're travelling. You've got a transplant, and then quality of life and survival after that. So it seems a relatively simple equation to balance up. But as I've suggested, the donors aren't well. Being sick in an ICU with a head injury is a typical problem, is not good for you, and that causes challenges to the lungs. Most lungs have traditionally come from situations where the brain is not working, but the heart is beating away, and there's this decision that it's essentially the person has died and any further management is futile. It's also possible to have lungs from a situation where the heart has stopped. Sometimes it's traditionally, again, we would know that that's likely to occur that after treatment is withdrawn. So there's two ways, and we've focused increasingly on the second mechanism of donation after cardiac death as a solution to some of our shortage of lungs. Then the transplant operation I won't talk too much about, but this idea of infection, rejection, and potentially getting scarring of the lungs and losing lung function afterwards are a real focus of working in lung transplant and the reality of dealing with transplantation and trying to hold all this together over the long term. So the challenge for us as doctors in lung transplant are that we've got real patients with real life-threatening issues. Again, it's not hypothetical. It's not something we'll see every now and again. This is upon us every week and in every clinic. And the solutions to these issues, even with experience, are not that easy to find at times. And we have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, but you still hit days where you're saying, I don't think anyone has ever seen this particular problem before, and I don't think there's I can't pick up the phone and ask anyone with any confidence anywhere else in the world what the answer is. We have to just start from principles and work through it. And if the problem, and if it's a recurrent issue with lots of people, then we need to find the answer, because as one of the world's biggest programs, we're more likely to find it than somebody else. So in solving the challenge of these clinical problems, we read about things, we talk to others, we go and visit them at times. Many of us have been to many other programs and sat in their meetings and seen some great things, and also seen some things that we know we do much better. It's important to not accept the standard sort of paradigms that the experts who tell you there's only one way to do things. In fact, often there's different ways. And the example I gave before about the donation after cardiac death or circulatory death as a source of organs, that was originally, that'll never work. A famous professor of medicine here said to us, there's no point in you guys looking at it. We've looked at it for kidneys and you'll never make it work. And then you have to say, well, we've got an idea, we've got a problem, maybe we can experiment, we can see how our experiment went, we can change it, we can research the problem, we can try and come up with a way that's better than previous. And if it's properly thought through and planned, and as you say, you get your successes and some that don't work, but you can then hopefully change practice, tell others about what worked, get further feedback. Indeed, it turns you into an expert if you talk about it enough. And you translated it, and you then go on to the next problem. Collaborate with others, work out how to improve things, and restart at number one. And a lot of our jobs as doctors is having this circle, because we know the answers are not going to come just out of a textbook or just out of the ether. We have to actually solve them, and that's why research and the thinking outside the box is a day-to-day occurrence here. So this is a picture from the Iranian donation organisation, and it struck me as being a really good image. You've got this poor kid down the bottom with their oxygen tube cut, and the adults all facing the opposite direction. And it's a real issue out there in the world that it's tough getting organs for adults, but it's very tough getting organs for children. We do children's transplants for all of Australia here at the Alfred, and it really touches at your heartstrings at some of these really sick kids and how they struggle. And there's traditionally not enough lungs to go around. So this was our problem. And we essentially looked at this, and we decided that what we needed to do was look at other ways of getting organs, not just the perfect ones that occur. So we've learned how to improve damaged lungs, how to treat infection, shift fluid, give chemicals and medicines to improve things. We've successfully cut lungs in half and in thirds, so that we can actually take out pieces of an adult's lung and put them in, so that for example, two halves of lungs from parents could potentially go into a child, or in our situation from an organ donor, we can carefully work out what's usable and put in the two bottoms of an adult's lungs into a child. And again, these are desperate times, and these you've got to think this through at weekends in the middle of the night. The donation after cardiac death lungs have also proved to be very useful for children, and we've done more transplants using these than anyone else in the world. And we go to the US meetings and point this out, and they're sort of they're hard to get and hard to use. But no, it's not. You create protocols and they can work. We've thought about using parents' lungs. There was an issue with a fad for doing this for a period in the US, but essentially it's a much more complicated process, and you're potentially putting 3 lives at risk rather than even just one with a transplant. We have looked at using pig lungs. There's happens to be some organs that have been altered to be genetically in the direction of human lungs, and we've done this, and the team in the front row has had their blood count down quite low after being transfused and getting dizzy during the experiments, because we put our blood through the pig lungs and put them on machines and shown that the lungs can go a certain distance, and we remain interested in this, but it's not proving to be as straightforward a solution. But the bottom line is improving the damaged lungs, cutting down the lungs, and using DCD lungs for children has seen our waiting list deaths, so the people dying on the waiting list is 5% in Australia. There's only been a couple of deaths over the years. In the US today, it's 30%, and it's similar in the UK. And they just don't get the idea that there are angles and corners, and individual hard work you can use lungs that they believe can't be done. And as I say, they sit there silently when you say this, and yet that's the reality. We've got a problem, and we've come up with solutions, and they actually work. And this is just a graph of our activity over the last 10 or 12 years or so, and the orange on the top is those donation after cardiac death lungs, and you can see that the graphs generally get bigger as we go towards 2017 on the right, and the orange part is the donation after cardiac death. And we've had a lot of experience with this. We're the world's most experienced centre, and it's dramatically changed our deaths on the waiting list for children and for adults. It's dramatically changed the way we look at the whole pool of patients that we're dealing with, and is a slide that we sort of proudly show. And again, it's something that needs to be copied by others, is being copied by others, but it's been a great success. The next one actually shows that. This is a slide looking at the proportion of lung transplants done per million population. And the summary is that the UK do it badly, the right one. Eurotransplant's a big sort of Central European group of transplanting centres. The USA, Australia does it better than all of them, but we do it the best in Australia. And again, this orange bar on top for 2016, shows that we've been able to make a real difference in the number of organs, and that improves the safety of everyone coming in and everyone else going out the other side. And as I say, you talk to the people from the US, you talk to the people from the UK, and they're embarrassed. And we've got to get you to talk, and we've got to get your notes, and we've got to, how are we going to do this better? And the answer is to say there are ways, there are things we've learned. You need to be copying. We need to be talking as we are, and these are exactly the type of slides and the type of presentations that we do in different places around the world. The second clinical challenge to touch on is that I mentioned that infections can be a problem after a transplant, and viruses can make you just a bit fluey and you get over it, but you can get viruses and potentially scar the lungs. So we get very anxious about viruses. So we have to be worried, and there are particular viruses, one particular virus that 50% of the population have that tends to play up after a transplant, called the cytomegalovirus. So we saw this as a problem. We knew it was causing acute problems. We knew it was causing long-term problems. So we set about looking to try and find solutions. And I think Glenn will probably talk more about this. So we started to work out where the virus lived, which part of the lungs, which component, which part of the body did the virus live in. So where should we be targeting it? We discovered it was living in the transplanted lung primarily. We then discovered that we could measure the amount of the virus, and that gave us an idea of how likely it was that the person was going to get sick. Then we realised that this was how much virus was in relation to how strong the immune system was and whether the body could kill the virus off. And then we were able to work out how much we could kill off using medicines, and more recently we've been able to show how long we should use the medicines, and indeed starting to measure how well the body kills it off. So in other words, really targeting this virus and really understanding it. And there's now a blood test that's available we've road tested, collaborating with the company who wants to get this out there, to show that in fact you can decrease the amount of CMV, which in turn has less symptoms, better long-term function of your lungs, better survival, and it actually costs less. And we're actually able to convince the Alfred to run it as a routine test because it was actually going to save them money. And the summary slide here is the standard treatment was getting that's 30,000 sort of units of virus in the lung, and you could see that using this blood test to determine who got the treatment and when, and then optimising it was you're able to show that the levels in the lung were much less because it was targeted therapy, and indeed so we were able to target which patients, when they got it, for how long, and then save money on the drugs and save money on the net testing, and so going from an idea of a pest and then really nailing it. But sounds good, all nice and shiny, but the other challenge of research, and the reason it's not done by everybody all the time in every place, is that it's got its issues. If you're going to be researching things, it requires resources and funding. The obvious resources and funding are to do the experiment, to bring the experiment to a conclusion, but there's all these hidden things. And it's got to be remembered that whether you're talking of the hospital or indeed often the university, that what they actually give to us is virtually nothing in terms of research and development. It's yes, there's some benefit in terms of letting you use the photocopiers and the lights and the power, but it all is a challenge. And putting through the hospitals committees, the ethics committee, a falsely called thing called the innovations committee, which is the committee to block innovations, not to facilitate it. Supporting staff, supporting equipment, paying for the medicines, and again, sometimes the best experiments are when we pay for them and actually really test them rather than someone potentially providing and any conditions. We need to be free to be able to make the choices and not have anyone else biasing us. And of course, you need the staff to stay. You need to be able to employ staff, offer them a career, and have them sort of train and work out, particularly in seemingly these little areas, but where they need to work and understand, learn, and be part of it. And the staff, around here, they're busy seeing patients. It's always got to be fitting around the clinical load. So that's the first problem. The second problem is this translation. Again, you can show that something works, but you have to then be able to actually bring it into the clinic, into the wards. And again, they don't just say, "Oh, that's a great idea." They turn around and say, "Oh, you now need to go through various committees. You need to pay for the staff. You need to somehow think how you're going to, if you're getting extra transplants, who comes at 2 a.m. to actually collate all the data on something you've done that's new because the system hasn't yet recognised it's real." And of course, not everything works as exactly as planned, and there are some false starts that we get at times where things aren't quite as successful as we would have hoped. And then there's the target. What are we doing here? Is this Greg Snell, Glenn Westall and the team overshooting? Are we trying to create a platinum sort of expensive service, or are we trying to just get above the line? And Gordon made this point. There are people who tell you, "Oh, well, what are we talking about? This is like grade 4 reading it. We just need to get everyone to read. We don't have to take the best people and make them read very well and be clever. We just need to get the average up." And we don't believe in that. We don't believe that the target is bronze. We believe it's gold or platinum. And for our patients, for their relatives, for justifying everything, we want it to be the best it can be. And then finally, down the bottom, it's an interesting thing that in this day and age that you've got this issue of patents and ownership. That there can be things that either you can't use because someone else wants you to pay for it and has a different idea of how it's going to be worked, or alternatively someone won't work on what you're doing because they're worried someone else will patent something and it might be a problem for later using it. And that's again something that as a sort of public, sort of philanthropic group in a way, we can actually do. We can say we will do this. We're not worried about later what's going to happen with legal cases. We're not a company who's trying to make money out of it. We're trying to save and change lives, and we'll be judged on that, not on whether we make a profit on whether drug X or drug Y really does work or its share price is going up. And that gives us some power to do that, and it can be frustrating sometimes to hear of people who won't go into certain areas because someone owns the rights to that drug. Whereas we say, well, we'll buy the drug and see if it works, and if it works, we'll continue to buy it. So in conclusion, we firmly believe that the research is worth doing and that it's worth translating it if you're going to do it. You don't do it just to say, isn't that cute, that molecule does something and someday someone will find a use for it. We're really keen to aim to solve the problems in front of us. And it's good for our patients to do that. It's good for other patients with other transplant diseases, and we've spoken on all the subjects you'll hear this afternoon. We talk to people, the kidney transplanters, the liver transplanters, the heart transplanters. They all know the stories from us. And there's other diseases too. There's the things that apply in the lung where you get scarring of airways or infections. They apply to little old ladies with pneumonia. They apply to people with asthma and the like. And we're forever using those ideas that have come from them to work with our work, and indeed feeding that back as well. And we talk about transplantation being something that is applies to the 100 transplants, but in reality, we're seeing other patients. We've got patients who are coming through who are referred for a transplant, and if we can find any way of them clipping the trees and heading off with a different treatment, then that's still really worth doing as well. So it's definitely not just about one thing. The other thing we've seen, and this is a theme that comes through, is that we've increasingly realised that the main thing is to be collaborating with others and multiplying the benefits, using other people's development. They can see what we can do, we can see what they can do, and that's Gordon's theme. I think success breeds success, and you discover that the world's an amazing place out there. And in summary, this is our viewpoint of the world, that it's clear that the North Americans and UK would regard the map as being the other way up, but clearly Australia is up the top, looking down on some of these other places, and as with a lot of things, a lot of things depend on what view you're coming from. Thank you.
Greg, just before, is there anyone got a quick question that they would like to ask? Or?
Yeah, there's two real issues to consider. The first is that in 2009, 29% of people needing it who were listed for a transplant didn't make it to a transplant, and the average waiting time was around 2 years. In 2018, 9 years on, it's gone from 29% to 4% last year. People died on our waiting list, and it's dramatically higher in anywhere else. And the other thing is then, and the waiting time for a transplant is more like 90, 100 days. Coming out the other end, again, we have significantly increased our survival. Essentially, every block of 3 years you look and it's jumped up higher, and it sits consistently, seriously above the world average. And we continue to, in the type of work we do, we're continuing to look at the ICU phases, the operative phases, the early stuff, getting out of hospital, and then continuing very much in the long term, focusing on what can we do at 7 years, at 10 years, at 12 years, etc. So all of that has steadily improved in here, and we're very, indeed, very proud of that result. And there's no question when we talk about our results overseas. There are groups who'll look at one part or whatever, but we're really trying to offer that whole package from the time someone's referred to get everything together for as long as possible. So I'm happy to take any questions if we're chatting later.
Okay, thanks. All right.